Hello everyone and welcome to today's CPD on management of knotweeds part 2. Following on from the first CPD, this talk will go into further depth about the reporting and management of Japanese knotweed and its close relations, giant knotweed and Bohemian knotweed. Your learning outcomes will include confidence in 1, how to quickly and accurately identify Japanese knotweed and its relations, and even when it is difficult, such as deliberate concealment, and 2, make an accurate risk assessment, including how to determine the source of Japanese knotweed, even when it has dispersed over 1 or more property boundaries. We will work through case studies and prepare an online plan for each example using a template that you can take home. Dealing with Japanese knotweed does not need to be a stressful experience again. Then you will learn how to quickly access valuable online resources about invasive species, including how to check invasive species records in the geographical areas you work in. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Frances Giaquinto. Fran Giaquinto is an independent plant ecologist who has specialized in invasive species and management for over 15 years. She is currently appointed by Galway City Council to prepare and implement an invasive species strategy across the city. Also, she is writing a field guide to invasive species of Britain and Ireland, which will come out sometime later this year. Thank you. Fran, please.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks very much for participating. I'm just going to share my screen. And first of all, one thing that I've forgotten to do in this talk is remember to kind of give you the resources, links to the resources. So what I'll do is I just forgot to add that part to it. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that after the talk is finished, I'll prepare something for you which gives you links to different resources that can be very useful if you need to find out anything more about Japanese knotweed or indeed other invasive species. So apologize for not including that in the talk. So anyway, this is the second part of helping you really become familiar with the issues of Japanese knotweed, and it's supporting the information paper that the SCSCI has just produced. So first of all then, what we're hoping to do today is to give you more confidence in how to make an accurate assessment when you see Japanese knotweed and what advice to give to your client. Now, in this talk, I'm keeping it very simple so that you can't forget it. But again, afterwards, if you require kind of a written template, I can send that on to you. That's absolutely no problem. So first of all, just going back to the information paper in section 1.7, it talks a little bit about the so-called downgrading of the seriousness of Japanese knotweed in terms of construction sites and property. And are we right in thinking that Japanese knotweed is not as serious as a plant as we thought 15 years ago, for instance? And I'm just showing you this image because I want you to see that, in fact, regardless of the legislation, regardless of what anybody says about whether Japanese knotweed is a serious issue or not, when Japanese knotweed becomes firmly established near to infrastructure, near to a building, near to a property boundary, near to services, then if it is left untouched and it's left kind of unchecked, and nothing is done about it, it can become a very serious issue. And so this image is taken from, it's one of the magnificent kind of Georgian properties around the squares in the centre of Dublin, in Dublin 4. And this was a property that had been rented out for about 30 years. Nobody had ever gone into the garden. When the tenants left and the owners went to look at the house, they saw, to their kind of shock, that the whole of the garden was infested with Japanese knotweed. And here is one example of where it's growing. So it's growing up through these granite slabs. It was growing through the granite staircase, through the services. And you can see that the strength, the sheer force of the Japanese knotweed in the ground is capable of pushing up these granite slabs here. just pushing them up, and that requires an incredible force. And here you can see, here are the younger canes. So they're kind of green, and they've got these very clear nodes along their lengths, very typical. And then these browner ones, now if you went and touched those, you'd easily break them. They're dead, they're brittle, they're hollow. These are the older canes, which shows you immediately that this plant has been growing there for some time. And then if you just put your kind of finger laterally across here to measure the width of it, you would see that this is about 2 centimeters wide, which means that is an old cane. That's been there for many years. So this combination of young canes, dying canes, and large canes means that this plant has probably been in that spot for 20, 30, possibly 40 years. And it's big enough to have pushed up these slabs, and there is one serious issue at this site. So in terms of how serious it is, I don't think Japanese knotweed should be downgraded. I think it is serious, a serious problem. The amount of money that's been spent on its removal is disproportionate to the severity of the plant. Like millions can be spent trying to remove it. That often isn't necessary. But nevertheless, when you're dealing with properties, when you're dealing with clients, it is important to stress that if Japanese knotweed is not dealt with properly, the owner, the landowner, the client can have a serious issue on their hands. So first of all, then I just want to recap very quickly on how to identify. We showed this in the first talk, but just for anybody who wasn't there at the first talk or anybody who just needs that recap, one of the key features about Japanese knotweed is that it stands out from the rest of the native vegetation by its bright lime green color. Okay, the next most important thing is that in Japanese knotweed, the leaves, you have the flat base. Now, very few native plants in Ireland have this kind of shield-shaped leaf with this very distinctive flat base to the leaves. And then it's got what's known as a sudden point. So it kind of, just here you can see very clearly this sort of sudden kind of point at the tip of the leaf. This is the most important features for you to identify Japanese knotweed at any time of the year, is the leaf shape. Now, when the canes are young, they're often red flecked, and they have these distinctive nodes along the length. The other key feature about Japanese knotweed, and the reason it's a problem, is that it doesn't have a root system as such, but has these underground stems known as rhizomes. Here they are. And these can easily break up, fragment, and each little piece can produce a new shoot. So if you disturb the soil in which Japanese knotweed is growing, you can break up those rhizomes, and each little rhizome piece can form a new plant. This is the key problem with Japanese knotweed. Okay, here, just wanted to show this one because it very clearly shows these young canes, the nodes along their length. They're green and they're kind of red flecked all along their length. Okay, here it is when it's actively growing. I showed this slide last time before. It's an attractive looking large shrub. This is why it won lots of prizes back in the 1890s and was introduced into gardens. Here it has these plumes of white flowers in late summer. The flowers don't come out until September, October. Okay, and then you have these kind of arching stems, which you can just see here. And then here, this is what it looks like in winter. This is an old plant. This has been sitting here growing for probably, again, 20 or 30 years. You have lots of canes, probably count about 50 canes in this one plant. These are the older ones which have died back from previous seasons' growth. They're hollow, they're crunchy. Here are the ones from the immediate season still standing. Okay, so this is a very typical feature of what Japanese knotweed looks like in winter. Now, one of the key problems now with Japanese knotweed, and in fact, it's one of the issues that we're seeing again and again in invasion biology, the science of invasive species, and that is we no longer have just Japanese knotweed. Okay, Japanese knotweed only produces female plants. So the plants that we have in Britain and Ireland, they're only female. That means basically all the infestations you see across Ireland are basically clones. They've established vegetatively. Okay, so there's nothing in Ireland or Britain up until recently which could fertilize those Japanese knotweed female flowers. So seed was never produced. Now, what has happened over the last 10, 15 years probably is another relative of Japanese knotweed called giant knotweed has arrived in Ireland. Now, this has male and female flowers, and the male flowers can fertilize the female flowers of Japanese knotweed, and so it can produce viable seed. And then, because it's a cross between the giant and the Japanese, you get a kind of cross between the two. And that's what's known as Bohemian knotweed, or hybrid knotweed is another name. This also produces male and female flowers. So the male and female flowers from Bohemian knotweed can fertilize the Japanese knotweed. The male flowers of the giant knotweed can fertilize the Japanese knotweed. And this means for the first time, and we're probably only seeing it over the last 5 or 7 years, is that Japanese knotweed is now producing seed, viable seed. So whereas before you had Japanese knotweed, which you could only kind of disperse by those rhizomes breaking up or the canes breaking up and being replanted accidentally, now it is dispersing by seed. Now this means, and I appreciate none of you are kind of botanists, some of you may have more interest than others. You're not expected to be experts in being able to identify and understand what's going wrong. But if when you're out and about and you find a plant that looks like Japanese knotweed but is bigger, then you might have giant knotweed or Bohemian knotweed there. And the really important thing to know about that is when you have giant knotweed or Bohemian knotweed in the locality where Japanese knotweed is also present, the chances are you're going to get seed dispersal, which means that plants can appear anywhere. So this is a really important point to just be aware of. Now, what does giant knotweed look like? Well, often giant knotweed and Bohemian knotweed can be very similar in appearance. They can be very difficult to distinguish. Sometimes even the expert botanists can find it difficult to identify between Japanese knotweed and Bohemian knotweed because there are some differences, but not many, and often the differences aren't consistent. But Bohemian knotweed and giant knotweed are likely to be much bigger plants. And here, this is an old quarry in Galway, and you can see this is a giant knotweed plant, and it is traveling, it is dispersed over 40, 50 meters, and you can just see here that the leaves are very large. Here's another example, and you could be really excused for not recognizing this as a knotweed. Okay, so here, but you can just see these canes. They have the red nodes along their length, and you've got these large leaves. Here you go. So whereas with Japanese knotweed, the leaves are generally about the size of a hand, a human hand, an adult human hand. Here, this leaf is much larger. Okay, and it has a rounded base. And this is one of the key features of giant knotweed compared to Japanese knotweed. Remember, Japanese knotweed always has that flat base. Giant knotweed will have a rounded base, but it has this tip, okay? And you can just see these stems, which have these red nodes along their length. Okay, so if you find something which sort of vaguely resembles Japanese knotweed, but is bigger, then take note. Now, a very useful app on your Android phone is PlantNet. Some of you may be very familiar with that. It's very easy to use. You just download it, you take a photograph of the plant you're looking at, you say whether you want to have a look at the flowers or the leaves, and it's pretty accurate. A lot of professional botanists will use it just to confirm identification. So if you think you might have something, a knotweed, either Japanese or one of the others, use the PlantNet app just to check, and it'll give you a good idea. And it'll also protect you from doing something really embarrassing, which a lot of people do, is, for instance, mistake bindweed, for instance, for Japanese knotweed, because there's a vague similarity in the leaf. Okay, so the PlantNet app is a very useful one to download. Okay, now here's another example. Okay, so first of all, you see this and you think, uh-oh, what on earth is this? And the first thing you'll notice are these canes. Okay, with the nodes along their length. Now, these are quite green, but if you get up close, you'll see that red fleck. Okay, now there aren't many plants in Ireland, not many native plants in Ireland that produce these canes. Bamboo isn't native, but it's very common. So it could be possibly a bamboo. And then you think, no, bamboo always has fairly narrow leaves. And look at the shape of these leaves. You can immediately begin to see they have that kind of Japanese knotweed type leaf. You've got the tips, and you've got actually the bases aren't flat, but they're slightly rounded. And this brown tinge indicates that somebody is trying to treat it with herbicide. It hasn't worked. But here you have a giant or a bohemian knotweed type. And you can identify it because you can see very distinctively these canes. Okay, so there you are. You can look at, if you look up on the web under giant knotweed or bohemian knotweed, you're going to get loads of images, and a lot of them are wrong. So that's not the best place to find to look for similarities. But one very useful website can be invasives.ie. And this has been produced by the National Biodiversity Data Centre, has a host of really useful information. And I'll send that link out to you separately afterwards. Okay, so there's just that picture about the problem that Japanese knotweed is no longer just Japanese knotweed any longer, because if giant knotweed or bohemian knotweed are in the locality, you're going to get seeds produced, and then you're going to get what's called hybridization. They're all crossing together. Right, now, the first and most important thing, if you're working in a professional capacity, or even if you're just talking to neighbors and friends, or you're buying a house yourself or whatever, if you come across Japanese knotweed or its relatives, the most important thing that you can say or you can do is you must prevent dispersal. Now, as a professional, to be able to remember to do that, to prioritize that, to emphasize that with your clients is the most valuable, the most helpful, and the most useful thing that you can do. You must prevent it from dispersing, because once Japanese knotweed has been disturbed, once it's started to disperse, it becomes very difficult to control it. Now, this I showed you last time. I'm just repeating it quickly, just for anybody who wasn't here last time. The reason Japanese knotweed is a problem once it's dispersed is because of its rhizome system. Here's a graphic. Rhizomes are underground stems. They're not roots. These are the real roots. Okay, these little insignificant things. These are the underground stems. Here are the nodes along the length. Now, each node has the genetic makeup to produce a new plant. And here, along here, here's the rhizome, very characteristic orange color when you break them open, or you scrape up the sort of the black gnarly bit on the outside, and you have shoots just shooting up along their length. You cut this into 3 pieces, you have 3 plants. Here, this is a very good example of what happens when dispersal, when the rhizomes are fragmented. There was a plant over by the wall. This is a community garden in Clare. They wanted to turn it into they wanted to plant fruit trees. So somebody came along with their digger. They scraped away the Japanese knotweed, thinking that this was the best thing to do. What they hadn't realized, they didn't know about the rhizomes. They broke up all the rhizomes in the soil, and hey presto, you literally get hundreds and hundreds of new plants becoming established. And how on earth do you deal with that? You know, literally when the whole ground is is all these little tiny shoots emerging from tiny pieces of rhizome, how are you actually going to mitigate in this situation? It becomes very difficult. Now, when you have a Japanese knotweed plant, here is the knotweed plant. That rhizome system extends in all directions. Some people reckon it extends up to 7 meters. This was the industry standard for a long period of time. Now, most people say that the rhizome system of even a mature Japanese knotweed plant, it will not extend 7 meters. I've never seen it extend 7 meters, but I have seen it extend 5 meters. That's in very mature plants that have been there for a long time. So what you know is that when you have a Japanese knotweed plant, what you see above ground is actually only a fraction of what is occurring below ground. Okay, and this is really important, is so all around a Japanese knotweed plant, where you can't see because it's in the ground, it's in the soil, there's likely to be a very extensive rhizome system, and you mustn't disturb that. So this is the key point about preventing dispersal. Don't disturb the soil or the ground around a plant. And this whole area, this is a kind of demarcation zone, okay? So what you're saying to your client is, and all of this is what's known as vector material as part of that's part of the legislation. What you're saying to your client is, okay, depending on the size of the plant, depending on whether there's any evidence of dispersal, we'll go into this in a minute, they want to create a barrier demarcation zone around that plant, 3 to 7 meters, 7 meters, very rarely necessary, in more instances than not impossible anyway, but say up to 5 meters. And you want to make sure that the soil and the plant within that demarcation zone is not disturbed for any reason whatsoever. Okay, so you just leave everything intact. Don't trim, don't disturb the soil, don't mow, don't cut back, don't do anything, just leave it undisturbed. And that is the best prevention of dispersal method that you can advise on. Okay, the other biosecurity is okay, is all around that zone. You want to make sure your boots are clean. Okay, so you brush your boots, or you kind of here is just a very easy system. Say if it's in a construction site, upside down brush on a pallet, and so people can brush their boots before they move into that infested area and before they leave it. Okay, so that's just a bit of recap. Now let's start looking at some case studies. Okay, so this is the first. I was very sorry that none of you were able to send in any case studies, because that would have really kind of brought everything into a much more kind of practical, real life kind of examples for you. But never mind, these are all real life examples that I've come across. So here's the first one. So here the client has bought this piece of land. It's an old factory. The factory is going to be demolished. But in the interim, they want this kind of prefab to be moved. Okay, and your job is to advise them. Okay, so you're coming onto the site, and the first thing you're looking for is Japanese knotweed present in this site? Okay, that's the first thing you're looking for. So you may spot a Japanese knotweed plant on the site. Okay, the second thing to look at is, if there's one, does that mean there's going to be more? So you want to look carefully around the site to see if you can find any other evidence for Japanese knotweed being present. And it's really good to check the boundaries very carefully, and also outside of the boundary, looking onto the property, because this is when things can really get very interesting. Okay. The next question you're going to ask is, how close are those plants to structures and essential services? The next one, what evidence have you got that Japanese knotweed has dispersed? And then what is the risk of dispersal? Those are two separate things. So first of all, I wish this was a live talk and then you could be giving me the answers. But here, if we're looking at this site, can any of you spot Japanese knotweed? Well, yes, there it is. Okay, how do you recognize it? The extent of it, the kind of the color. Look how different it is from, look how different the color is from the native vegetation around. It's kind of stands out. And then if you get up closely, you can begin to see the shape of the leaves. So, okay, you've got a fairly sizable stand of Japanese knotweed here. There's long grass all around. Is there any other Japanese knotweed? Well, can't see it in this picture, but there is some here. Okay, so we'll go to this second picture. Here it is. Here's the structure. Here's the Japanese knotweed. Now, how do I identify this as Japanese knotweed? Well, first of all, look how the color stands out from the native vegetation. Then look at the leaf shape, and you can see this flat base to the leaves. Really distinctive. Okay. And then this sharp point. And here you've got the sort of the vestiges of the plumes of white flowers. So definitely Japanese knotweed is here. And the leaves are smallish. They're smaller than my hand, which means you haven't got Bohemian or giant. Now, what else is there about this? So in your mind, you're thinking, okay, Japanese knotweed is present. If it's present, are there other plants present? So already you found that big stand, you found this one. Okay, so it has dispersed, because that first plant was a big old stand. This one looks quite new and actively growing. That's a clear sign of dispersal. Now, what else is going to create the alarm bells in this picture? Okay. Well, what worries me is how there are young plants down here. Okay, so here's the original plant. And what's this? They may be just arching stems, or are they distinctive new plants? So you'll need to go and look. You'll just need to go and look around those plants to find out whether they're young little plants growing in front of this one, or whether they're just the arching stems of this one. Either way, you have a problem here, because look how it's becoming hidden. Okay, all this vegetation here is just growing over the top of it, and it's beginning to disguise it. Now, what does that mean? That means, well, if I'd bought this property, okay, and I was wanting to do something about it, well, the first thing I'd be doing would be I'd be wanting to kind of clear the vegetation to see what the problems are with this property, what the kind of the base of the structure looks like, whether there's anything salvageable, or whether it all has to come down. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be coming in and strimming here, or mowing, or just cutting back. And that immediately is creating a dispersal risk. I may not even see the little Japanese knotweed plants under these cleavers here. I might just go in and strim, and thereby accidentally dispersing the infestation everywhere I go with my strimmer or my mower. Okay, so these are little plants under here, by the way, which means that it's been disturbed, and what's mostly happened is that the soil around here has been disturbed, which allowed the rhizomes to be fragmented and the new plants to establish. Okay, so here's my risk assessment then. First of all, Japanese knotweed is present. We found at least those two stands. that Japanese knotweed is right up against that structure. It's within 1 meter of the structure. And if you remember, there's this kind of this boundary thing. If your Japanese knotweed rhizomes can extend up to 7 meters, so if your Japanese knotweed plant is within 7 meters, 5 meters of a structure, you know you have a problem. If it's more than that, then it's manageable. You can deal with it. The rhizomes haven't actually reached that structure probably, unless the plant has been dispersed. Okay, that's your first step. The second one, there's an older and larger stand. In that previous photograph, I showed you that big stand. So now you know that dispersal has happened. This is an old factory building, so it's probably from the movement of soil, it's probably from vegetation clearance, it's probably from people not realizing they had Japanese knotweed and what the problem was. Regardless, it's dispersed. That creates an alarm bell. Okay, those young plants are hidden under the long grass in front of the structure. That's creating a very high risk of dispersal. One, because they're hidden and people won't see them, and all that overgrowth of vegetation means that clients may trim or mow to clear and thus disperse it further. And I think probably that's what's happened across the entire site. This is a high-risk site. That is your conclusion. Even though there's only that sort of one smallish, youngish plant growing by that structure, because it's dispersed, because that old stand further over is there as well, which shows that the plants have been here for a long time, you have a high-risk site. Okay, what you're going to tell your client, Japanese knotweed is present, it's dispersed, very high risk of further dispersal. You need to create demarcation zones around those plants. Now, when it's so near to a structure, it's impossible to create a demarcation zone. But what you can do is you can make sure that nobody goes disturbing that plant further by trimming or mowing the vegetation. So to create a barrier, this is what you're advising your client. Don't disturb the vegetation or the soil within this demarcation zone. And for this entire site, I would be advising no movement of soil, no cutting back of vegetation, because the Japanese knotweed has widely dispersed and we don't know exactly where it's gone. We may not be seeing it all. Okay. Now, your client options. Now, just for you to know about, it's not your job to advise your client on the methods of eradication if they want to proceed. Your job is to tell them that further investigation is needed, and also that they need to get a competent professional in to advise them properly. All invasive species work is very tricky. To effectively and successfully remove an invasive species from a site, you need skill, you need knowledge, you need careful contractors. So, but their options for this particular site, for your interest, is you can eradicate it by herbicide, but it's already dispersed, which means that you're going to have to be treating it once a year, probably for far more than 3 years. It could be up to 10 years, because you don't know where it's going to pop up. Okay. You can physically remove, but Japanese knotweed is controlled by legislation. It has to be done under license. That makes it very expensive. If you take it off the site, it's going to cost you tens of thousands. You can bund it on the site. So what you do in that case is you dig up the plant, you put it in a specific area wrapped up in a Japanese knotweed barrier membrane, and you put it right out of the way so that the renovation of the structure can proceed. So that's also a method. But again, not as expensive as taking it off site, but it's certainly tricky. Installation of root barriers can be done. And that means that the ground in which the Japanese knotweed is growing can be kind of isolated from your structure, but the root barrier only is guaranteed to last about 30 years. So it's only a temporary method. Okay. In all eventualities, you're going to use a combination of the above methods. But whatever you do, you know that it's going to be an expensive option to eradicate. Now, with that very fallen down structure, Is it worth spending a lot of money to remove the Japanese knotweed in order to renovate the structure? Probably not. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to this original picture. Here we have the original stand. Here we have the new that new plant that I showed you right up against the structure. Now, I was also asked by a separate client to come and do a site assessment of this field, which is going to be developed for housing. Okay. And if you go round the boundary and look at that stand from the other side, this is what it looks like. So if you thought it looked bad in the previous photograph, now you'll see that it's very, very extensive. That new little dispersed stand is just behind this tree. The structure is just behind that tree. And you can see this old factory here. So now I'm going to develop housing in this field, and this is on my boundary. Okay. What advice do you give to your client in a situation like this? Well, first of all, if you're out there, you're actually going to be looking not just at this stand. You want to actually get into the neighbours, the adjacent property, to check just how dispersed this plant is. And in fact, in this site, it's dispersed all over the place. There is nothing but Japanese knotweed in this site. An absolute nightmare to deal with. Okay, but this is the property boundary. We're going to build houses here. What are you going to do about this knotweed? Okay, what are you going to advise the client? Well, it's a very serious problem. Unless this particular landowner is going to deal effectively with this Japanese knotweed, you have a very high dispersal risk, and there is going to be a continuous risk of the knotweed dispersing onto this site. And all during construction, there is going to be a risk of Japanese knotweed dispersing onto this site. What are the options to the client? Well, really the only option, and it's, it seems extreme, but is to advise that actually a wall is built, that some kind of barrier is built in front of this. It has to have to be way beyond the plant because of that 5 to 7 meter zone in which those rhizomes can occur. You're going to need to build a wall along here and then install a vertical root barrier. So basically, you're creating a physical barrier to prevent any of this knotweed from moving onto the site during construction. So this just shows you how important it is that when you're asked to advise, and when you come into a site and you look at and you see Japanese knotweed, is to really look around, to see, for instance, what's happening the other side of the boundary. Because you might find that the whole situation changes in the advice that you can give, in what can be done, changes when you see what it looks like the other side of the boundary. Okay, so here we go. So here's another one. Here's a second case study then. This photograph I showed you very quickly in the previous talk. This is an old stone cottage. It's for sale. Okay, the estate agent actually denies that knows anything about Japanese knotweed, which isn't really appropriate these days. And here is the plant. Now, you'll be familiar with the shape of the leaves of Japanese knotweed. That's kind of instilled in your mind. So when you see this plant with these kind of canes, red flecked, lots of nodes along their length, these bright green leaves, flat base to the leaves, just like shields with these sudden tips. Hey presto, you have Japanese knotweed. Okay. Japanese knotweed is within a meter of the structure. It's right, it abuts the structure. So how serious an issue is this? Well, whoops, didn't want to do that one. Okay, so, well, first of all, you've got Japanese knotweed. Now, there's quite a few bits of information that you can glean just from this young plant. Okay, Key one is that it's young, okay? So you've only got a few stems. It's actively growing, but it's young. You haven't got a great big stand. It's growing in between this shrub here and the wall. So what's going on there? How has it got there? Has it got there by accident? Has somebody moved soil into this particular garden? Has somebody deliberately planted it? What's the situation? You need to find that out, but in order to find out how extensive this infestation might be. Okay, so first of all, Japanese knotweed is present. It's within 1 meter of the structure. If that client owns that property and wants to renovate that property or do anything with that property, the alarm bells are immediately there. It's within 1 meter of the structure. There's no way that you can renovate or do anything to that structure without disturbing the soil in which that plant is growing. And the number one rule around Japanese knotweed, if you remember, is don't disturb the soil around the plants. Whatever else you do, don't disturb the soil, because you'll break up the rhizomes. Each rhizome fragment is capable of forming a new plant. And what are you going to end up with? You're going to end up with a horrendous mess. Okay. Plant is young and actively growing. That means there's probably an older plant somewhere else, okay? Check for other plants. Has dispersal occurred? In this example, I couldn't see any other plants, okay? Your advice to your client is to implement your biosecurity, is to create that demarcation zone. Now, it's right up against the building, so you can't create it all the way round, but there is a risk that if that little house doesn't have a proper foundation, as many of those old cottages didn't, that plant could be under the wall and underneath the house. Okay, so that's why it's important to know how long that plant has been there. If that plant has been there for 30 years and somebody has just repeatedly cut it back, which is why you're seeing the young shoots, the chances are the rhizomes are definitely under the kind of structure. If it's only been kind of there very recently, for 2 or 3 years perhaps, the chances are there won't be extensive rhizome development, which means that it may be safe to go and do some renovation as long as appropriate measures are put in place. Whatever happens, you need further investigation and you need to seek professional quotations for removal. Okay, another high-risk site. Your advice to your client: your Japanese knotweed presence, it abuts the structure, rhizomes may have extended beneath the wall. The plants are young. When the plants are young, it means there might be an older plant somewhere else, or it means that the plant has been repeatedly cut back. Ask the owner. The only way that you can find out about what the situation is to ask the landowner, the property owner, to try and get some history. Okay, because the extent of it is unknown, even though it only looks like a little infestation, because the extent of it is unknown, say the property owner has died and you don't know history about it, it makes it a very high-risk site. High-risk sites are potentially very expensive. Okay, if your client wishes to proceed, professional invasive species contractor must be appointed. Okay, here's another quick example. Okay, so again, a young Japanese knotweed plant. How do you know it's Japanese knotweed? Well, here you have the stems, these zigzaggy stems with the red. Here's the nodes along the length, flat base to the leaf, very clear. You can see it here. Okay, very clear here, flat base to the leaf. Now, this particular incident would worry me very much, and I wonder if you can guess why. Okay, so not only is the plant right up against the structure, but somebody has come along and put a piece of wood along here. Okay, and why was that done? Okay, and here you can see Japanese knotweed creeping up in between. Now, this immediate alarm bells. Has somebody been trying to conceal or suppress the Japanese knotweed by putting this piece of wood up against it, just by sort of sticking it there in the hope that you're going to stop it from coming through. Well, no, piece of wood isn't going to do the job. Here it comes, up it comes through here. It means that it's underneath the wall, it's underneath this structure, and this is very high risk. Okay, major work will need to be done in order to make sure that whatever work gets done on this structure, it does, the knotweed isn't dispersed. Okay, just going to miss these because we'll come to this in a minute. Okay, so again, here your risk assessment, you're going to confirm the ID, use PlantNet app if you want to. Is the plant within the 7 meters of an important structure? Yes, definitely. Has dispersal occurred and what level of risk? If you can't see dispersal, it doesn't mean to say that dispersal hasn't happened. That's when you need to kind of ask these questions. You need to be a bit of a Sherlock Holmes to kind of just find out what has happened to that plant. The really important thing is that there's no blame to be had here. You know, nobody can be expected to be experts on plants. And often if you have a troublesome plant in your garden, you're going to try and take action to deal with it. The problem is if the action is the wrong action, you make the situation worse. But that's not because somebody's a bad person. It's just because they're not informed. So the really important thing is when you're talking to your clients is that, you know, you're not talking in a kind of blame way. Is that it's being able to kind of get the confidence of your client so that they can share information with you, or the property owner, that they'll be willing to share information with you. Always advise your client on biosecurity, whether it's going to be your demarcation zone, keeping your boots clean, not going into infested areas because of the risk of those rhizomes being fragmented. Okay, now here's just another case study, and this was really a bit of a tragedy, this one. So this is also in County Clare, and a couple had saved up and saved up and saved up, and they'd bought an old cottage, and they'd had an extension put onto the cottage, and everything was under mortgage, you know. So and they had this very nice extension built. Now, what they didn't realise was that the person who they appointed to build the extension either didn't realize Japanese knotweed was present in that particular spot, or they knew it and thought they could deal with it. But basically what happened is the whole site was scraped. So a digger went in, scraped 1/2 meter of soil away, flattened it all out, built the extension, and what do you think happened? Well, I can't show you the full extent of it without sort of showing you a video. But what happened was that because the builder had really scraped the entire site, this house now is sitting, it's like an island in the middle of a sea of Japanese knotweed. It's certainly the worst site that I've ever seen. And the thing is, at first glance, you don't spot anything. So we came in, we had a look, very nice extension, looks as if it's been done quite well. And then you just start noticing these little plants popping up all over the garden. How do we know this is Japanese knotweed? Well, this reddish stems, zigzaggy stems, flat base to the leaves, okay, sudden point to the leaves, lime green color. And throughout the entire site, you have these little plants popping up. And here's another couple of examples. You can just see how difficult it might be to spot it. This is in the older part of the garden with old stone walls. Here, really clear, flat base to the leaves. So there you have it. You have Japanese knotweed has been spread throughout the entire garden. Now, there is a liability issue here in the sense that the person appointed to build that extension should have known that Japanese knotweed was there and should have known that actually it has to be removed professionally and not to scrape it. Denied responsibility, of course, and because the owners, the house owners, have a mortgage, they're afraid to tell the mortgage company about the problem, so they can't take any action against the builder. Okay, so they're left in this situation where they have young children, they have pets, this is their dream home, and they're sitting in this nightmare of an acre of land, which is completely and totally infested with literally thousands of these small plants. Okay, what do you do in a situation like this? It's extremely difficult. How do you advise? Okay, they don't want to use herbicide, but in fact, herbicide really is the only viable option. Okay, now, if somebody was coming in to say, buy this property, you would recommend that they didn't. It was absolutely best avoided. If you find that you've got massive dispersal of lots of little plants coming up all over the place, okay, and you recognize them here like this, then it's a completely unknown, you're moving into a completely unknown territory. Because the other thing with rhizomes is that they can go dormant. So when you have, say you have a rhizome system that's been completely fragmented, you have thousands of little rhizome fragments in the soil, just sitting in the soil. Some of them are going to start producing shoots straight away, and that will create shade and they'll take a lot of nutrients. Okay, so there may be quite a lot of rhizome fragments in the soil which are thinking, okay, you know, all the nutrients are being taken, there's too much shade there, it's already a bit crowded, I'm just going to stay asleep. And this is what dormancy is basically. They just stay asleep. They don't die. They stay asleep. They stay dormant. And Japanese knotweed rhizomes can stay dormant for years and years and years. Okay, the literature says 40 years. I don't think that's true, but I've certainly seen it at 25 years. So even though those property owners that property owner of this particular site may be able to say, okay, we've got rid of all the Japanese knotweed, all the visual evident Japanese knotweed, in fact, an awful lot of it may remain hidden. So this site is never going to be safe. They're never going to be able to kind of dig it over and create vegetable beds and flower beds. But probably what they're going to do is they're going to just reignite the infestation there. They're never going to be able to build other structures there. The risk, the real risk, is that actually the Japanese knotweed was left underneath the extension. The extension was built on top of it. And what's going to happen is you may end up with Japanese knotweed beginning to kind of push through into the cavity walls and things like that. Okay, so really, really difficult issue and absolutely nothing that can be done about it other than a steady control program where you're steadily trying to reduce the level of infestation. Okay, now I've run out of time, so I'm going to actually stop there. And I realize that we haven't gone through those kind of key points. But what I hope is that there'll be some discussion here and that we'll be able to come through those key points as we're talking. And then I can send you the some sheets after this. So just went on a little bit longer there. So I think I'm just going to end the show if that's all right. And we'll raise it for some questions.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much, Fran. Most interesting talk. What I'll do is I'll go straight to questions so we can keep it moving, if that's okay. First one, is it possible for Japanese knotweed to grow from infected soil that has been transferred from an infected area?
Yeah.
Japanese knotweed present in an area that a builder has claimed the soil was bought from a different site.
Yes, this is probably the main way that Japanese knotweed gets dispersed. And it was the main reason that we have a massive problem of Japanese knotweed in Ireland was probably because of the Celtic tiger, and a whole load of soil got moved from one place to another. And there's a tremendous amount of, that one of the key things is that if people are buying topsoil, if for their gardens, say, they must get the person who's bringing that topsoil to guarantee that that soil is not infested with invasive species. Because I've seen, and again, I've had so many phone calls from people phoning up saying, oh, I got some topsoil into my garden, and now what? And I spread the topsoil all around the garden, and now what's happened? I've got Japanese knotweed coming up in 100 places, and it's a complete disaster. It then becomes a situation like that last case study. So absolutely, topsoil, any kind of soil, any kind of ground materials is a key reason why Japanese knotweed is dispersed. Yeah, absolutely. It can be very serious. And of course, people are going to deny it, so that's it. Yeah, don't bring it in the first place unless you can guarantee that it's clean. Yeah, very good
Thank you.
question.
What are approximate costs for treating the knotweed?
That's a very good question. And of course, it's as long as a piece of string. It depends on how old it is, where it is, and it's dispersed. But the key thing, and you can really make a judgment now going on after this talk as to how much it's going to cost by whether you have dispersal or not. Now, if you have a Japanese knotweed plant, it's been sitting there for 40 years. It's huge. Nobody has ever done anything with it. Nobody has ever tried to treat it. Nobody has ever tried to cut it back or dig it out or disturb the soil around it. Then actually herbicide treatment is relatively quick and cheap. Okay, so you'll have to treat it once every year for about 3 years, but then you're probably going to get rid of it, and you can successfully get rid of it. The moment it's been dispersed or disturbed, or somebody has tried to treat it with herbicide, you're ending up in a completely different situation where you don't know how long it's going to take to treat, which means you don't know how much it's going to cost. As soon as you have dispersal, as soon as somebody gets at it and starts messing around with it, you have a problem, and your costs are going to go up 3 or 4 times. Now, herbicide treatment, there's an environmental cost, of course, but if it is done properly at the right time of year with the right equipment, with the right herbicide, it doesn't have to have a big environmental cost, and it certainly doesn't have to have a public safety cost. If you're creating a public safety issue by using herbicide, then you're using that herbicide wrongly. That's the bottom line, okay? So now herbicide is almost always going to be the cheapest option, because you just need somebody there to do the work once a year, and that's it. It takes half an hour or a day or whatever. As soon as you start digging it up or cutting it back or moving it, then because Japanese knotweed is controlled by the Birds and Natural Habitats regulations, it's an offence to knowingly disperse it. So everything has to be done under license. So if you're digging up knotweed and taking it to licensed landfill, well, you're probably talking 5 or 6 figures. Okay, even for a small infestation, because all that infested soil beneath it is going to have to come up as well. Okay, so moving it is very expensive. Herbicide is relatively cheap. Moving it is expensive. You can have a middle option where you dig it up and actually retain it on site in a bund, wrapped up in root barrier. That's a middle cost option. So now, one other point I'm just going to make about the cost is I can't say it's going to cost so much per square meter or anything like that. That's impossible. But the vast majority of contractors out there are charging ridiculous prices. Okay, really, it doesn't have to be an expensive procedure. So if you can find the right contractor who's going very competent, knows what they're doing, isn't going to charge you the arm and a leg, you can probably get away with clearing a fairly sizable infestation, definitely for less than 5,000. Okay. But once you start moving it, once you start getting with contractors that are charging huge amounts of money, one contractor can charge 5,000, another can charge 20 for exactly the same job. So I suppose the moral to that story is check with several contractors before you proceed with the work. Yeah, hope that's helpful.
Okay. I think unless Grace interrupts me, we'll just take another question if we can fit one in, please. Hi, is there any type of ground penetrating radar system in use that can facilitate establishing the full extent of root system underground?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there isn't. But in the UK, they started to train dogs as rhizome hunters. You know, just the same way that you get pigs as truffle hunters and actually dogs as truffle hunters. They've actually started to train dogs to hunt out rhizomes. How successful it is, I don't know. I know that it's expensive because I know that I've got a client at the moment who's looking into it, where you've got very high dispersal. But in terms of actually having some kind of technology which can penetrate the ground and see the system, and to be able to distinguish a Japanese knotweed rhizome system from other roots that are in the soil, it could be quite tricky, but it would be an incredibly interesting project to try out. Yeah, good idea. And if you know anybody in the field, then that's something that'd be really interesting to actually look at. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Fran. Wonderful presentation, and thanks for asking questions, and very technical for especially building surveyors in terms of risk assessment. So thank you very much for that. I'm afraid we'll have to call a halt. We're just slightly over time, 1 minute over time. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Apologies, I couldn't get to all the other questions. Thank you again, Fran.
Just Bridget, one thing there is if you want to send me the questions, I can answer them.
So.
And then in a document, and that document can be sent out.
Lovely. That's
Okay.
super. Thank
So
you very
sorry
much.
to go on there, but hope that was useful. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye
you very
now.
much. Bye bye.